I used the power of my brand to grow the show. Now, how do I use the show to grow the brand? And how can I use this audience that I've built and continue to grow and understand who they are to drive more value to the greater brand and the greater business as a whole?
This is Recorded Content, a podcast for small, scrappy B2B marketing teams who want to get the most out of podcasting. In each episode, we'll explore how podcasting can drive your company's content strategy, build brand awareness, and help you connect with your ideal customers. Let's get to it.
Hey, this is Ben. I'm the Managing Director of Podcasting at Motion and your host for this episode of Recorded Content. Recorded Content is brought to you by Motion, a done-for-you podcast agency for small, scrappy B2B marketers. Today, I have Lindsay Tjepkema on the show, and Lindsay is the CEO and co-founder of Casted, which is a B2B marketing platform for brand podcasters. Lindsay, thanks for joining the show.
Thanks so much for having me here, and kudos to you for sticking the landing on Tjepkema as a last name. You did that very well.
Thanks. Yeah, no, I appreciate it. It's funny with my last name is Decowski, and it is spelled just as it sounds. But of course, because of that, people always think that it's something different. So
right.
That's a point for me on the day. But yeah, I guess, we'll go ahead and jump into it and kind of get started here. But, one of the things that, as I was looking kind of into your background, obviously you spent about 15 years in B2B marketing, before you started Casted, right? So at that time, you had actually started your own branded podcast. Can you tell me about, what led to the creation, of that first podcast, and just kind of walk me through your own podcasting journey?
Yeah. So you're right. I spent at least 15 years in B2B marketing, always on the brand and content side of things. And my big soapbox always has been, but especially now, has been the most human brand wins, right? And so as marketers, our opportunity and challenge is to be the connective tissue between the brand that we represent and the audience that we're trying to reach. And the more human we can make that interaction, the better, right? And so as my career evolved and as streaming in general and, phones being able to give us video content and audio content became more and more of a thing, it just became so abundantly clear to me and so many other marketers like me that this thing that you and I are doing right now of having a conversation and capturing it and sharing it with our audiences would be the thing. And so saw that, seized the moment, and started a show. Not only audio, but we did some video work that really brought the voices of our customers and our thought leaders and our product leaders and our partners to our audience in a way that was really fresh and relevant, but frustrating because I couldn't do with it what I wanted to do, which is why Casted exists.
Yeah, no, I love how you talk about being kind of that connective tissue. And you mentioned there that, there are so many different ways now that you can kind of interact with, with your audience. And it's interesting in that when you think about how you would typically, or a company or a brand would have to interact with their audience in the past, there was never an instance usually where they would be openly invited into their home in the way that you can do with things like video, audio, like podcasting in general, right? And it's always interesting to me to think that hey, I'm listening to podcasts right now, which is basically like a branded podcast, which is basically learning more about, that brand or that company or that industry. And that's something that before I would never necessarily, invite somebody into my home to just come and tell me about, themselves or their brand.
Can you imagine somebody knocks on your door and they're like, can I tell you about account-based marketing? And you're like, yes, come on. Would you like to go for a walk with me?
Yeah, it's my parents probably tell me, close the door and say it's dinner time.
Yeah.
It's always, why do you always come during dinner time? That's what that was always the famous.
Right.
So I bring that up is because it sounds great and wonderful, right? It is, but at the same time, it's not as easy as it sounds, right? So, as you got started, what would you say was the most challenging kind of, hurdle when you were actually launching the podcast and, starting to put together all this great content?
Yeah, I think probably something that you and Motion run into too, which is, how do I do this? I don't know what to do. I certainly felt that way. I'm sure your clients feel that way. I know that our clients feel that way. Probably not so much anymore because it thankfully is becoming more common. Podcasting and video content is more common now, but definitely still run into that. Like, I don't know what to do. I know how to blog. I know how to publish written content. I know how to white paper. I don't know how to podcast. So that was a big one. And so, trusted through the guidance of trusted advisors like Motion Agency. I had a production agency that came and worked with me and helped me understand what to do and how to do it. That was the first hurdle. And then the next one was, okay, now what? So I have this content and I had all these great ideas and things that I wanted to do, and very quickly found out that was a pipe dream. It was like, oh, that's cute. So you want to know who's listening to your show? That's cute, which is changing now too. So.
Yeah, it's funny. I guess we've all kind of been there, but it's interesting because I also heard you talking about it on another podcast. I want to say it might have been How Leaders Lead with David Novak.
Oh, yeah.
I believe it was that one, but it was, you talked about, hey, if you've got 10 listeners, as long as they're the 10 right people, then it might well be worth it for you, right?
Right. Absolutely. Especially in B2B.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it's easy to kind of it's easy to miss that, when you're in a moment, you're looking to see, hey, how many people are listening, who's listening. As long as you have the right people listening, to your point, I think that's the most important thing. But so I guess, what about it? Yeah, obviously you started Casted, right? So of course I would imagine that you have a passion for podcasting, but what was it that kind of developed, that passion for you?
Yeah,
at least
it's
to
funny.
the point where you'd start Casted.
Yeah, that I would leave my career as a marketer and go try out this, venture-backed founder thing. It's funny, at our launch party way back in, I think it was February 2020. Yeah, it was like one of the last things we all did as humans before everything shut down. I said it then, and I've said it over and over since then. I didn't start Casted because I love podcasts. I started Casted because, again, I really believe in this whole concept that the most human brand wins. And how do we do that? Well, whatever we can do as marketers to help establish those human connections, the better. And so I just am so bullish, to use an overused term, and excited and passionate about what podcasts and video content can do to connect brands and people, that once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. Once I saw this opportunity, once I experienced firsthand this need to say, okay, yeah, we have this show, but now what? Like, what in the heck are we going to do with this episode? How are we going to make sure that we're not just shouting into the void and having a very, a recorded conversation that doesn't do anything? Per the name of your show, what good is recorded content if it doesn't do anything? And so how do we know, and what do we do with it? So like I said, once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. And that's what led to me making the leap and doing this thing.
Gotcha. So as far as, I guess, let me take a step back first before I can ask this next question. But, for people who aren't familiar with Casted, do you mind just telling us a little bit about kind of what Casted is and how you kind of work with companies?
Of course. Yeah. So Casted is a software platform that works with specifically B2B marketing teams at mid-size to, mid-market to enterprise level companies to say, hey, okay, you're a marketing team, you're responsible for this brand, you have a podcast, you have some video content, you're doing webinars, you're doing all this virtual event content, live event content. Cool. Now what? Like, what are you going to do with this content? How do you get it out to the world? Sure, there's lots of options there. You have lots of options for hosting platforms. We do that, but then what else? How are you going to manage it? How are you going to search through it later to see what you have and how you can repurpose it? How are you going to break that long form content down into short form to be used on social media or to get in the hands of your sales team or to embed it into blog posts? How are you going to use all those little snippets and those little nuggets of the great things that people are saying in those conversations across other medium and other channels outside of your podcast, outside of your RSS feed, or outside of your YouTube channel? What are you going to do with it? And then how do you know that it's how do you know it's doing anything? Who is engaging? So that's what our software does for the brands that we work with.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's not just so much as making a conversation a centerpiece of your content strategy, right? I mean, to your point, it's once you have that conversation, you have that content, you know, how are you using it? But also, like, I love how you talked about, like, what happens next though. Like, what are the measurables around that you can actually take and run with, and actually, you know, kind of figure out how you're actually doing, you know, once you put out this content, is it resonating with people, is it not? So you've mentioned kind of the two mediums between like audio and video a couple of times here. And I know that you're a big proponent of video, as am I, but how do you see the balance between the two playing out in the future of B2B marketing?
I don't see that it will be a balance of the two. I think that it's going to be one and the same, more or less, right? You know, it's funny because recently I was talking to someone we were talking about doing a virtual summit, which I hope to do on a very cool thing very soon. But then we were getting into the nitty gritty of like, how would this work and how would that work? And I was like, well, this is basically a webinar. And they were like, yeah. And then they're like, well, what do we do after? Like, so that's live. And then what do we do with it? I was like, well, that's basically a video podcast. And like, they're all the same thing, you know? Right. I mean, if it's live streamed, then is it a virtual event or is it a live webinar? Is it an on-demand webinar or is it a video? To me, it's sure, there's lots of different things that we can call it, but I think it's a matter of semantics at this point. I think that if you're having a conversation, if there is content to be recorded and you have a choice of whether to record video or just audio, do both and capture both, share both, not just for the sake of more content, but because there's so many different ways to use it now and ongoing, and so many different ways to engage people and to make sure that what you're communicating is being received in a way that is rich and relevant and engaging. So I think it's both, and it's yes.
Yeah, no, I love that answer because I selfishly like listening. So I love audio, but I also love having the video as well. So it is helpful, at least in my opinion. And this is, you know, something that we tell a lot of people that we work with is, you know, if you're going to do audio, you might as well, if you can do video, just do both of them, right? Because it gives you a lot more like wiggle room to basically work on that kind of like redistribution, right? It's not just, hey, we only have these audio clips, but now you have you have this full video, and you can make these video clips out of it. You can do promo videos, you can do all sorts of things that can supplement, you know, other parts of kind of your content strategy. But yeah, that brings me to, I've seen like amplified marketing a lot when it comes to, especially on like when it comes to casted and amplified marketing, right? So can you tell me about like amplified marketing, what it is, and kind of how it differentiates from like traditional, you know, content marketing approaches?
Yeah. So again, going back to what I thought, I guess looking back, I guess it was naive. What I thought I was going to do in my last role before Casted was I was going to record all this content. We were a global company. And so the power of Zoom long before our pandemic was going to allow me to have all these great conversations and use them and equip them, you know, use them to fuel conversations with sales and social media, just fuel all the things. But there was no way to do that. And so this software, yes, but then this approach of amplified marketing says, okay, go record the stuff, have the conversations, get on the stage, capture the moment, right? Capture that original thought. Yes, turn it into a show, turn it into a podcast, turn it into on-demand webinar, virtual summit content, whatever you want to call it, capture it, right? That's the nucleus. That's the hub of the wheel. How then do you wring it out? You break it down into pieces, you atomize it, you make it into short form content, and then you amplify it. And that's where the amplified marketing part comes in. It says from one, many. And you know, you take the clips and you embed one into a blog post, and you take another clip and you get it in the hands of your sales team so that they can have a conversation about some great thing that somebody said on your show. And it's through that amplification that you extend your reach, and therefore extend your impact, and therefore expand your ROI. That's the whole idea, is that it's not keywords or ideas from a boardroom fueling content strategy. It's conversations with the experts whose original ideas and original content are fueling literally everything.
Right. So it all kind of comes back to, you know, that human connection or you know, building that bond, you know, or that human side of your brand almost, right?
Absolutely. 100%. That's the why.
So we talk about this all the time with our clients. The reason I bring up amplified, marketing is because I love this B2B podcasting maturity curve that you have. I think it's a great way to kind of break it down. And I think it does kind of help. It's interesting in the 5 stages that you have it broken down into, because I think as you work through those, it kind of lends itself to helping you kind of create almost that human side while also kind of measuring the success of it. But can you explain kind of what the podcasting maturity curve is and what inspired you to create it?
Yeah. So focusing specifically on podcasting, because marketers and brands have been doing videos quite a bit longer. Mm-hmm. But we noticed, as far as what inspired us to do this, is that we noticed in all of the conversations that we've been having over the last 5 years nearly, that there were a lot of conversations around, okay, everything from how do I get started and like what does starting a podcast look like, all the way on up to how do I grow my audience, and then how do I ultimately drive brand growth and business impact. And so it started to become this like, wow, not all of these conversations are not created equal. There's different levels of sophistication. So that led to ultimately breaking it down into stages. So you start at stage 1 with basically, it's an experiment. The whole outcome of that initial stage of getting started, specifically with podcasting, is just to be creative and to think about how this thing could possibly be something that would be valuable to the business. It's an idea. Stage 2 is, okay, how can I turn this crafty idea into an actual thing and commit to a regular cadence, right? That's like, hey, we're doing a show. You have a feed, you start to get into a regular rhythm, maybe you have some processes that emerge. Stage 3 is where a lot of businesses really, or a lot of brands or podcast owners start to kind of be like, oh, I have a thing on my hands. That's where you start to really think about audience growth. You have a show, you have a regular rhythm, you've realized that you're good, bad, or otherwise now in this routine of like, we got to do this once a week, we got to do this twice a month. And you start to say, why? But like, who are we reaching? Like, how do we grow this audience? And that's where it starts to become really important to not only grow your audience, but know who they are. That's where a lot of brands think things stop. They're like, oh, I have a show, now I just need to grow my audience, right? Which, cool, but you're missing out on half the picture and arguably the most lucrative part, which is, okay, so you have a show and you can use all of your different brand assets and brand capabilities to grow that show. But then a cool thing happens where you flip a switch to saying, okay, I use the power of my brand to grow the show. Now, how do I use the show to grow the brand? And how can I use this audience that I've built and continue to grow and understand who they are to drive more value to the greater brand and the greater business as a whole? So that gets into what we just talked about with amplified marketing of like, how can I take these clips? How can I take these key takeaways and start to grow my social media following, start to grow my audience list and my email list and really support sales? And then stage 5 is the holy grail of saying, okay, I've grown this show. Used the show to grow the brand. Now I'm using the brand growth and how this is all fueling each other to really drive business impact, which for most businesses is revenue. And here's how sales is involved, and here's how CX is involved, and here's how I know, because I can see it in CRM, how I know that it's actually driving real value for the business.
Yeah, and I think you might be seeing I'm having a bit of a light bulb kind of go off as just hearing you talk through it. But as you're starting with like stage 1, for example, and it's interesting to see kind of how they play into each other. But really, if you follow those 5 stages, you're giving yourself the opportunity to, not only that stage 1 being create more of that creative side where you're just giving yourself the opportunity to get out there, try it out, experiment, but then get into more of like a consistent cadence with it. And during that whole time, I would imagine that it is enabling you to really build up kind of that human connection, that you were talking about earlier.
Yep.
And then taking that, and this is kind of where the light bulb now goes off, is you take that then at that point and you're able to, instead of just, build up your own brand, but, build up your company's brand as well and kind of turn the tables on it. So it's interesting, hearing you kind of talk through it, where it is the whole, all 5 stages follow that same process of, kind of creating that human connection, but then also while obviously having some of that business impact. So when that transition happens, I guess, let me ask, what would you say is the most challenging step that, you see companies, kind of get hung up on as they're going through it?
Yep. Stage 3.
Stage 3.
So sure, it is, as we mentioned earlier in the conversation, it is sometimes a challenge to get started. Some individuals or teams will get really hung up on like, well, what do we call it? And how do we do that? Like, yes, the show creation, that can be a thing. But I think the dangerous part, the dangerous hang up is thinking that stage 3 is the end. Like, okay, we've got our show, we've got our routine, we've got our format, we've got our layout. It's a great show. Audience is growing. Awesome. You left off everything else. I mean, like the other end of the story, like you just established the foundation. Now build the house. Like you're leaving everything on the table if you're not like, why are you doing this? Like you made this, you made a great show and you've grown this audience. Now what? And what are we even doing here? Like, what are you going to use that show for? How are you going to use that to actually drive brand growth, which is why we're all here? And how are you going to use that to drive real like revenue and make sure that what you're doing matters? And how do you know? So that's where I think that there's danger, is if you think that growing an audience, like getting into a regular rhythm and growing an audience is the point.
Yeah, absolutely. Is that, you don't just build a house to walk away from it, right? So, we get a lot of questions around measuring ROI, and I think it's a tricky question to be able to answer, because I think it varies depending on who you are and kind of what your show is about and what the goals are. But I'm curious, to hear from you as far as like when people are looking to measure ROI for their show, what would you recommend, businesses in like stage, I guess 3 or 4, measure as the impact of their podcasts on like sales, for example? Yep.
So you've got to understand who you're reaching. You have to, because otherwise you get into really abstract numbers of, and I've literally been there. I had a CEO at my last, what led me to start Casted. I had a CEO who was actually really supportive of the show, loved the show, would high-five me in the hallways and be like, I listened to the show this morning while I was running. I love the show. And we were in his office and he said, what's it doing for the business? From an encouraging, like, I can't wait to hear what it's doing for the business. And I was like, 10,000, we hit 10,000 downloads, which at the pace at which we did that was great, but that meant nothing. And so you get into a really dangerous place if you can't say who and you're just saying how much. Because even if you have 1 million downloads, it's like, great. What does that mean? How has that turned into leads or pipeline or opportunities or sales? And if you don't know that, other than self-reported attribution, which is great and it's important, but is that enough? Is it skewed? I mean, it's biased because you're going to have people who love the podcast say that they found you through the podcast, people who, it's just, you've got to know who's engaging and how that engagement overlaps with your target accounts, how that engagement overlaps with people who are in pipeline, how that engagement overlaps with current customers, so that you can start to say, hey, of the people who listen to the show, their deal cycles tend to be shorter. They tend to spend more with us. They, there was an influx when we started the show. Like, if you can start to draw correlations of who is engaging with your show and what your pipeline looks like and what your funnel looks like and how that's actually supporting sales and CX, that's when you can start to say this show is actually making an impact.
Is there like a point within I know we have this, like you have the 5 stages, but is there a point of like the life cycle or the life of the podcast where it would make sense to really start honing in on those metrics more? Because I know it's tough as you start out, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, especially in the early stages, you're putting out content. Again, you're trying to be creative, then you're trying to get into that consistency. But how do you know when it's time to really like hone in on what some of those metrics are telling you, and like actually make a change, or like basically utilize the metrics that are available to you?
Yeah. So it's interesting because as you're getting started, one, you don't have enough data to make decisions, right? I mean, if you're trying to make decisions and pivot and change course, or should we keep doing this thing or not after 10 episodes, like, you and I both know, like, that's not enough. And also that early on, you've got to focus on the goals that are relevant at that stage, which is another reason that we did this maturity curve, was because at stage 1, as you are exploring a creative option and you're saying, hey, is this a thing that we could do? And what does this look like? And do I want to do this? You shouldn't say, how many leads did we get? Like, it's not, those things don't line up yet. Stage 2, the whole outcome is to say, can we get into some processes that make sense? Do we feel like this is something from a bandwidth perspective and from a thing that we feel aligns with our strategy? Can we make a thing? And the goal there should be, yep, we did what we said we were going to do. We said we were going to publish 10 episodes this quarter, and we did it. That's the goal at stage 2. Sure, if leads come in, if customers convert, awesome, but that's not the goal yet. The goal, it doesn't become about some of the outcomes of like audience growth and who are we reaching until you get to that stage 3, because it's just not mature yet. One, you don't have enough data. You don't have enough of a track record to make sound decisions. And it's not sophisticated enough yet. It's not mature enough yet to be able to make those calls. You haven't given yourself enough game tape, as somebody on my team likes to say.
I love when I hear that, the first thing is where are the leads? Where are the leads? It's like, well, it's $1 million question, right?
Yeah.
And I think that can sometimes be almost kind of like the death penalty of a podcast if you start it with just hoping to get leads, right off the break, because it is a process, and also you have to know kind of what it is you're going to be getting out of the podcast. What's the goal of it? So, if somebody is looking to start or considering starting like a branded podcast, you've seen it on kind of both ends, obviously, where you were the person who was actually tasked with starting the podcast, and now you're working with them. As you literally started casting, you're working with branded podcasts all over the place. So what are some things that people should consider, as they're thinking about starting a podcast before actually jumping in both feet?
Yeah, it's a good question. One, I don't think it's a question of should we do it. I think that there's room for some sort of show in everyone's marketing strategy. Why? Because you should be talking to your customers. You should be talking to your partners. You should be talking to the people who should be on your show. You should be talking to them anyway. And why not use a show to not only engage with your audience with those conversations, but also to build relationships with those people who you should be recording? I mean, like I've done that. Like I've had some great partners and I've had some great customers, and it's important to it's worth the time. It's worth the time to serve your audience that way. And it's worth the time to build those relationships. And so check that box. Everybody should have it. So then as you get started, it's okay, how do we do that? Who are the people that are important for us to build relationships with? Who is the best person who has the subject matter to ask the questions and to host those conversations on an ongoing basis? And then, who are we trying to reach? It's all about who is it for, who should it be involved first and foremost, and why are we doing it? Once you have those questions answered, then you can start to really block out, like, how often are we going to do it? And how are we going to do this thing? What's the format look like? But the who is really important first.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think you always have to understand, like, the biggest thing, as people are getting started, the biggest thing that we ask, it's always the first question, right? What is it that you do differently, and who are you helping? Who are you helping with this podcast, and how? And I certainly think that is a differentiator, and, shows that, that last and make it and do well, as opposed to shows that don't. And I think kind of going back to that whole, human connection part, you have to be able to know, if you don't know who it's for, who you're talking about, who you're helping, it's hard to be passionate about the show for an extended period of time. But I think that's a good spot to end. I know we're coming up on time, but where should people go to learn more about you and Casted?
Casted.us is our website. The Casted podcast is our show. And I am most active on LinkedIn and would love to talk to everybody there.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Lindsay. I really appreciate you, taking some time to jump on recorded content with me. We'll talk soon.
Thank you so much.
And that's a wrap for this episode of Recorded Content. This show is produced by Motion, a full-service podcast agency that's all about working with B2B marketers. Starting a podcast is hard, but it doesn't have to be. Visit motionagency.io and get everything you need to launch and grow your customers' favorite show.